Hello. This is Tales of Dread. Tonight, you're going to meet some Wendigos. I have spent the last 2 summers leading canoe trips on Lake of the Woods in Minnesota. I have had a few close calls and heard many stories from other guides about their experiences. People have lived in this area for thousands of years, and we can't camp in many places because they are Indian reservations. I've heard that this area is called Wendigo country, and that places like the Wendigo Isles are named after it. For example, I've heard a lot of scary stories from other guides that I could tell you if you're interested, but I'll just tell you about this one thing that happened to me. On this trip, it was just me, another guide, and about 7 kids. After a long day of paddling, we stayed the first night at a campsite called Little Trisket. One of the campers we were with was on the autism spectrum, and while we were making dinner over the fire, it was hard for him to talk to us. Something caught his eye in the woods behind us. He kept asking, "Who is that man in the woods?" and describing the man as tall and skinny and all white. We told him there was no one there and that we had counted everyone to make sure they were all here. So we looked, but there was nothing there. So we just ignored it and went back to making dinner. That same night, another camper was in her tent by herself because she was the only girl on our trip. As my co-guide and I were starting to nod off, we heard her say, "Stop, Gilly Vanilli." We told her what was in her tent, but she didn't care and went to bed. When it was morning, we asked her what was wrong, and she said that her tent was shaking, and since it wasn't windy, she thought it was us. All of the boys were in their tents, and we were all in ours, too. When we took down her tent, we took out the stakes, and 2 of them were completely bent at a 90 degrees angle. We tried to bend it, but no matter what we did, we couldn't get it to move back at all. I've been in crazy wind storms out there with probably 30 to 40 miles per hour winds, but I'd never seen a stake like that. But when we left Little Trisket, the strange things stopped, and we had a great trip. Afterwards, when we got back to base camp, I talked to a guy who had spent the next night at the same campsite. She told me there is some kind of big white animal at that campsite before I even said anything. She told us that she was going to the bathroom way back in the woods and thought that another camper had come to her bathroom spot by accident and ran away. But when she got back, everyone was still there, and no one had even left the fire while she was gone. There are stories and events that are much scarier. Since then, other guides have worked with these ghosts up here. I could think of it. I've loved hunting squirrels, deer. It started as something my father and I did together, but when he died I couldn't help but see myself out there more and more. It was his favorite thing to do, and I was lucky enough to do it with him. After what happened next, I'm afraid to go back into the woods because I miss him so much. It was a snowy Saturday morning looking back, and the sun had just come up that day. I had been looking for squirrels, but the woods were dead quiet, so I sat still under the skeleton of an old oak tree. It didn't matter if I saw or killed anything. The best part was the beauty. Getting up early and taking it all in was worth every second of quiet and cold. Everything was suddenly stirred to life by a gruff grunting sound. At first, the sound was like a buck's call, but it was much lower and more guttural. At first, I thought that a big deer was lying in the snow and dying. Then it came back, but this time it was close enough to make my heart stop. Whatever it was wasn't dead, but it had moved a distance that was impossible. I had no idea what I was hearing during those few seconds. I had no choice but to sit still and try not to breathe. Only moments later I saw something that has changed my life in the worst way possible. The head of a deer with a sickly look and eyes with way too much white appeared from behind a tree. I can see 15 yards ahead of me. The worst part was that it didn't move at all. It was 9 feet above the ground. I've never seen a deer that tall before. This thing looked like it had just been in a fight while trying to fight off a deadly virus. When a hand with claws showed up just below it, it wasn't a pretty sight. I could tell this wasn't a deer. It sounds like a story from a book of scary stories for kids. I know, and I wish all of it were true. But these skeletal fingers wrapped around the tree's trunk, and their nasty nails slid along the bark. Because of how its head was turned. It was as if it was staring at me, into my soul instinct then took over. I grabbed my gun and I ran as quickly as possible back to my truck. I had never run so fast in my life, but when I heard that grunting again, it seemed to get closer and closer, no matter how far I ran away. When I got to my truck, I opened the door, slammed it shut, started the engine, and floored it. But before I really took off, I made a mistake. I looked into the woods and saw that the things the king had in his clawed hands were now sticking out of a pine tree at the edge of the forest, as if they had been copied and pasted. I'm sorry, Dad, but I don't know if I'll ever go back there again. Stephen met a Wendigo more than once during the summer about 5 or 6 years ago. The first time he met her was on a trip in the summer, when they were going to Shoal Lake. It was a 6-day trip that involved paddling about 60 miles. And one portage, where you carried your packs and canoes over a small hill and into another lake. On day 4, they were taken back out of the shoal by porting Jing. Through a place called Dead Man's Portage. Sounds like something from a scary story, but the portage from Lake of the Woods to Shoal is called Dead Man's Portage. I don't know why they call it that, but it fits. About a half mile from the portage, there was a campsite that gets used a lot. This campsite is just called Dead Man's. Stephen and his group left Shoal Lake with plans to go through Dead Man's Port and then stay at the campsite. It's a little long, but it's a nice highway without too many ups and downs. I believe. The Canadian Parks Service even cleans out this portages, which may be the only one that is frequently maintained in Lake of the Woods. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite is a beautiful and strange one. All the way, it goes through a small inlet with 10-15 foot high moss-covered cedar-covered cliffs on both sides. Stephen and his group got to Dead Man's campsite. Later, right before they went to bed, they realized they had left their sleeping bag pack at the end of the portage. Around 9, it was getting dark, so Stephen and another camper set off in a canoe with their headlamps on to get the pack quickly. It took them about 30 minutes to paddle, and at this point, the only thing you could really see was what your headlamp was shining on. They took the pack and turned around to go back. Soon after they left, Stephen heard loud splashes as things fell into the water behind them. At first, he didn't believe it because there are a lot of beavers in the area, and when they slap their tails, it sounds like a big rock being thrown into the water. However, the splashes kept coming, and they were right on his back as they kept paddling. Stephen looked behind him and saw a basketball-sized rock come flying at him and land next to him in the water. They started paddling like crazy to get back to the campsite and away from whatever was throwing these huge, heavy rocks at them. Stephen looked back between paddle strokes and saw 2 bright red eyes about 15 feet up on one of the cliffs. They got back home after the rocks stopped coming at them. Okay. The rest of their trip went well without any more problems, but I don't like going through Dead Man's Portage and always make sure I don't leave any packs behind when I do. I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I'm scared to death and pretty sure it was a Wendigo after hearing stories and reading about them online. Something came after me, my son, and my girlfriend. We were camping in the far north of Washington state. My girlfriend is very superstitious, so she insisted we bring weapons. So I brought my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a 22 caliber rifle and a machete that had just been sharpened. At the time, our son was only 3 years old, and she and I were on the edge of a cliff when we were stopped by a park ranger who seemed very tense and uneasy at first. Instead of taking our weapons, he told us to be careful and stay safe. Then we were sent on our way to camp. When we got there, people told us that they had heard strange noises and seen a pale creature that would imitate the voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or didn't seem to be paying attention. I laughed and put the idea out of my mind, thinking to myself that there was no way they were just messing with us, but I knew better. So when we got to the spot where we were going to set up camp, we made a fire and set up our tent and bags right away. While my girlfriend ate a snack, I fed my son. Then we looked around to see what was going on. So, my girlfriend and I went hiking for about an hour. I had one of those backpacks for carrying babies, and as my son got bigger, he got really heavy. Now, everything seemed normal until I saw something down the path we were almost on. We got closer to find out what was going on and saw drag marks. Something looked like it had killed a deer. There was a hole shape in the dirt, and a small pool of blood that looked like it had been pulled from the antlers and left to dry. No man could have done that because the buck or whatever it was would have been too big for that shaken. We ran back to base camp, started a new fire, and hurried back to our tent because it was dusty and we were afraid to leave. We stayed inside the tent at this point, and my girlfriend eventually put our son to bed, probably because he was tired from being scared. We fell asleep. After what seemed like hours, I woke up to a faint sound that sounded like a baby crying. I looked out the window and saw what looked like the outline of a buck standing over something. It looked about 20 feet away, but when I got closer, I saw that it had very long legs for a deer and was very tall. I fired 2 shots at it, and it let out a loud, blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend woke up screaming because I had fired shots. I tried to explain what I had heard, but to my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then I saw the blood stains on the side of the animal. It looked like a lot of blood was running down the side. It got going. It looked right into my eyes, making me feel scared to death. I got a creepy sense of dread, as if it knew I couldn't move. I thought, what if it starts to run toward us? Just then, this tall, old, demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I couldn't tell exactly what it was saying, but it seemed to say I need more. I want more kids. My boyfriend's girlfriend yelled out and asked where our son was. We shut out. When we woke up in the morning, there were park rangers at our campsite. We couldn't find our son, so we told the rangers he was missing, and they started looking for him. I told them what had happened, and they seemed to believe me, which was strange. The one who seemed to be at least 10 years older than the one we met earlier pulled him along and whispered something in his ear. I only heard one line, and I'm not sure if what I heard was even right. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't act like they wanted us to be on our own. So they came to wait with us while they kept looking. We stayed in a log cabin with a forest ranger for 3 days. Then, all of a sudden, some rangers came into the cabin and told us that they couldn't find our son. My girlfriend started sobbing. I start to hate myself when I think about all the things I could have done if I hadn't been so scared. We ran outside and saw some police officers who were hurt and scared. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything about what had happened, what they had seen, or why the police were so scared. We only know that we no longer have our son. God help the next person who goes into that forest, and please don't bring your kids. I grew up in the mountains of North Georgia with my brother. We went camping and hiking a lot. we did it all the time. So, whenever Ryan and I had time off from school, we went straight to the woods. We packed up our stuff, told our parents we were leaving, and that was it. We decided to camp about halfway through Jack's River Trail and Cool Water Wilderness. It was a trail we knew pretty well because we had used it a few times before to get used to long hikes. Around lunchtime, we drove to the trailhead, parked the car, got our gear together, and headed into the woods. As we walked, we passed a few hikers. We asked them how the trail looked, and they always said the same thing. Wet Jack's River Trail probably crossed the river 50 times or more as it went along its 17-mile-plus journey in late fall when it was getting colder. It took more work to keep the trail dry. We moved further along the trail and began looking for a place to set up camp. Here is where Ryan and I went wrong for the first time. Ryan and I have a rule that we don't camp near other people if we can help it. Call us paranoid. But the last thing we want is for someone to drag us out of our tents and into the woods, never to be seen again. So, we always camped a good distance from the trail in an area where people didn't usually camp overnight. After about 2.5 hours, we found what we thought was a great spot to set up for the 2 nights we would be gone. When we got to Horseshoe Bend, we went about a half-mile off the trail and set up camp in an open area. Late that night, we made a teepee fire and set up our tents on either side. After unloading, we decided to walk back to the trail and check out some of the swimming holes along the way. Jack River gives you. I was surprised at how few people were on the trail since it was Thanksgiving break. Maybe it was because it was early in the week or because it was raining, but no one seemed to be hiking or even staying the night. At 5 o'clock, Ryan and I went back to camp to start a fire, make dinner, and get ready for the night. As soon as the sun went down, it got very cold, so we added more wood to the fire, sat close together, and just talked. Ryan was 2 years younger than me in school. I was a senior and he was a sophomore, but we had always been good friends since we were kids. Around the age of 9, we always hung out in the same groups, played the same sports, had the same hobbies, etc. We made ourselves at home around the fire. I had just texted her mom to let her know we were safe and getting rid of her bed. I remember we were talking about how much we hated going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having the same awkward conversations with family every year. When things started to get strange, we only saw them on vacation. We were used to hearing sounds in these woods, which are full of animals like deer, black bears, and even a wild boar now and then. If you spend enough time in the woods, you learn to tell the difference between some sounds and what we were hearing. Ryan and I heard what sounded like a person sneaking around slowly just out of sight with a 4-legged animal. I can only say that it was strange. You can hear a tight group of steps, but what we were hearing didn't sound like a person walking slowly or trying not to make too much noise. I remember that we both got our flashlights out and pointed them in the direction we thought the sounds were coming from, but that wasn't the strange part. When we shined our lights on a spot, we thought the sound was coming from there, but then the sound seemed to come from somewhere else. It seemed like many people were walking around us, and then they started whistling. At first, I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking that maybe the wind was just blowing leaves around and what we were hearing was just the forest around us. Ryan turned to me and asked, "Do you hear that?" I didn't answer, and I was trying hard to pay attention to each sound. 2 notes in a row, then a pause of about 3 to 4 seconds, and then 2 more notes in a row. Again and again. Ryan kept asking me if I heard that, so I put my finger to my lips to stop him from talking. I felt unbelievable fear. I knew I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, so I clenched my teeth and my fist. Even if it was anything. It seemed like the whistling went on for a long time. But Ryan had been thinking about it for maybe 5 minutes before he finally yelled out into the dark. "Hey! Quiet!" No one was whistling anymore. The sound of wood being broken up stopped. I was angry. I gave Ryan a "what the heck" look. And he gave a shoulder shrug. He told me I had to do something. I could only shake my head. We sat there in silence for a few minutes before we heard noise in the woods. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistler played 2 notes in a row, then stopped for 3 to 4 seconds, and then played 2 more notes in a row. How could someone whistle this loudly and run at the same time without their voice breaking? I was done. I stood up and shined my flashlight in every direction, hoping to see what was making us crazy, but I saw nothing. We could have reached out and touched it, but we never saw anything, and the movement stopped. But the whistling never stopped. It was so loud that it was hard to hear. I told Ryan to call the police when I looked at him. Now, this is the part I will never forget, the part I don't like to talk about. Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher telling them where we were and what was going on while I was in the car. I walked past the fire to get to my tent. Inside my bag, I always carried a 6-inch fixed blade with me because I thought it would make me feel safer than just holding my flashlight. I tried to keep my eyes on the woods as I unzipped my tent. I could hear something moving right in front of me. I moved my flashlight up in front of me, and I saw it in maybe 2 seconds. Whoever or whatever it was about 5 feet up in a tree. About everything. It had long arms, legs, a neck, fingers, and everything else. When it saw the light, it jumped backwards off the tree and ran away. I heard it land, but I never saw it. It either jumped an impossible distance or landed in a thicket. I don't think I've ever screamed so loud before. I ran back to where Ryan wasn't sitting down. He asked me over and over again what I saw, but I couldn't tell him. I kept thinking about what I had seen, and maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, followed by 3 guys asking if everything was okay. I put an end to the event and asked them what they had seen or heard. All they said was that they heard a lot of moving around and then my scream, which is when they came toward us. I tried to tell you what had happened without making you think I was crazy, but it didn't work. One of the guys walked around for a while and then told the others that he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we had called the police, and a park ranger showed up about 30 minutes later. Ryan and I tried to tell him what was going on, but he just thought it was either a curious animal, or some other campers trying to mess with us. Ryan and I decided not to stay the night, so we packed up our things and followed the ranger out of the woods. He took our statements, and then Ryan and I got in the car and drove home. Ryan and I don't talk about what happened that night, but neither of us has been back to Jack's River Trail since, and we probably won't ever go back. I need to talk about this experience somewhere where people will finally hear my story. On February 17, 2017, between 1600 and 1700, I'm pretty sure I saw a wendigo in the woods behind my house. I live in a place where wendigos could have been seen. I don't say it wasn't a wendigo, though. Anyway, I have found mutilated animals and horrible scenes of death, rot, and decay that would make even the most experienced veterans throw up. The sights have been horrifying, and this really supports my theory that something is back in those woods. For example, I found my second dead fox about a month ago. Its head and spinal cord were about 30 feet downhill from the mess of mangroves that used to be its body. The front left leg of its body had been torn off, and there were big scratches on its chest and sides. Also, its intestines were spread out among the trees and bushes after it had been gutted. There were also signs of struggle, like some kind of black liquid under its nails, which came from another animal. I'm leaving out a lot of details, but those should give you a good idea of what happened. Now, I'll tell you the most interesting part of my experience with this evil spirit. So let me show you the lay of the land. My house is about 100 yards from a small stream that runs through a small wooded area, and divides it in half. On the other side of the stream from my house are big trees, so one day I was out there and all of a sudden I felt cold and uneasy, like I was being watched. I also started to worry more and more that someone or something was out there with me. So I went inside because the sun was going down, and I had to get to work soon. So I started walking toward my house, which meant I would have to walk uphill. So I started walking, and when I came out of the woods, it looked like someone had told me to get off their property. Not moving quickly, but moving with a plan. I felt like someone was really looking at me, you know. So I turned around and saw a big creature standing across the stream from me about 80 yards away. Then it took a step toward me, and even though I'm not very athletic, I'm not super weak either. I think it would take me about 30 to 40 seconds to run about 20 yards uphill through the woods. Yes, I got out of those woods in about 10 seconds. It scared me the most I've ever been, and it gave me the most adrenaline I've ever had. Now, you're probably wondering if I was dehydrated or having hallucinations. Well, I've never hallucinated in my life, and I wasn't thirsty because I drank a whole bottle of water about 10 minutes before this happened. And I always make sure I have water with me before I go exploring in the woods. And it couldn't have been a tree, because every time I go outside, I go to the spot where I saw it, and there isn't a single small tree that even comes close to what I saw. Afterward. Even though I haven't seen it, I can hear it. Native Americans think it is true. This window screams for help like a person to get people to come to it. I have heard what a little girl calling for help in those woods sounds like before. Still, it's scary to talk about or think about. Could someone help me or tell me I'm not going crazy? With a family home in the city, my wife and I have been in that rat race for years. 2 dogs and a cat is the classic American dream, but living in the city took its toll, and the neighborhood got worse. Crime went up. We even tried to figure out how to get out. When I got a new job out of state, it gave us a chance. It was a great career move, but we didn't want to move to a new city just to have the same problems all over again. So, we started looking around and found a great mountain community about an hour and a half from the job and a great ranch-style house with a big back porch, windows everywhere, and a lot of land. In the backyard, there is a large grassy area and a creek that runs through the middle of the property. After that, there were acres of woods. I mean, it's very big. The house is bigger than our house in the city by more than 2 times. All of it is new, and there are no other houses within a mile. It's very different from how we lived in the city, but the best part is that it cost less than half of what we're paying now. Our old home. The house had been foreclosed on, and when we asked the listing agent about it, she just said that the previous owners had left the property. We didn't think much of it because people who can't pay their rent do things like that all the time. The first 3 months were pretty quiet as we got used to our new life, and the kids got used to their new school and friends. Most of all, we got used to living in a big house with a lot of land. But then it got cold, and strange things began to happen. It started with sounds coming from the back of the property. We thought it was because we were in the woods. Then the motion lights around the house started going off at random, but we just thought it was because we were in the woods. But everything changed last night. Last night was the scariest night of my life. One of the dogs was whining and scratching at the back door, so I thought he had to go to the bathroom. So I quickly grabbed my flashlight and left the house through the back door. Something wasn't right. The dog ran to the backyard, growling and spitting as it went. It was about 30 degrees outside, but the dog jumped right into the creek, swam to the other side, and ran into the woods at the back of the property with the flashlight bouncing. I chased him and called his name. When I got to the creek, I crossed the makeshift bridge to try to catch up with him. I could still hear the dogs growling and barking from up ahead, so I moved away from the safety of the house and deeper into the woods. That's when I heard it, a shriek like I've never heard before in my life. It sounded like a cross between a whale moaning and metal on metal. It rang through the trees and stopped me right where I was. My dog came bounding back to me and hid behind me. When I turned around, I could just make out the warm glow of the house behind me. In the cold dark ahead of me, I wildly swung my flashlight around to find the source of the noise. Then, out of the cold silence, I heard a sound that was even scarier. I could hear my wife's voice everywhere. The voice said something. When I turned around again, I could just barely make out the image of my wife inside our house, where she was safe. Again, the voice said, "Baby, I'm right here," but this time it came from deeper in the woods. Then another voice came, and it was just as clear as the first. And it was the voice of my dad. "Come out." It called here. I moved the flashlight around again, and this time I saw a brief flash of light coming from someone's eyes. The creature was in the light beam for less than a second, but it was about 6 feet tall, ash-colored, and white. It held on to the trunk of a pine tree with long, skinny fingers. Then it was gone, so I turned around and ran back home. I ran straight into the cold creek and fell. My dog ran past me and got back to the yard and up the porch before I could catch him. I dug my hands into the cold, muddy bank and pulled myself out. I didn't even turn around to look back. When I got to the porch, I ran inside, and my wife ran over to me quickly and asked what had happened. I could only shake my head. I'm not sure what happened myself. I felt more and more afraid tonight. As the sun went down, we kept the dogs inside, and I haven't been brave enough to look out the back window, but as I type this, my motion lights in the backyard keep going off one by one. I'm the kind of person who doesn't believe everything that is said about the supernatural. My wife says she's an empath and can see ghosts and dead people. And I'll admit that she is very good at guessing how people felt about places and families in the past. But I can't take what she says as fact because I can't prove it. With that said, you can choose to believe me or not. But what I'm about to say is so unbelievable that I have a hard time not believing it myself. I can't say that I've ever had a paranormal experience, but there are a few things that happened to me when I was very young that I just can't explain. By the time I was 12 to 18 months old, I either remembered my life or had a very clear idea of what it would be like. Before I was born, I was floating in the sky and standing on thin air, with no land in any direction. In front of me was a kind-looking, middle-aged Native American man in a plain white robe. He asked if I was all set. Some kind of vision came into my mind, and I said, yes, I did come down and see my own birth. Remember that this was before I could understand what giving birth was. So I didn't know anything about Native Americans. I started having very clear mental pictures of something very scary when I was about 6 or 7. I saw a thin, tan face that looked like it had been mummified. The eyes were dull, but they seemed to be alive in a terrible way. And the mouth and nose got smaller. The wide smiles and full set of very white teeth were the creepiest parts of the face. When I was 9 or 10, I read for the first time about an expedition or group of people who went to the Antarctic and had a bad time. Several of them died and the rest were left behind. Their bodies were found in the 20th century, and there were pictures of them in the article I was reading. I had never seen a frozen body before, but as soon as I saw those pictures, I knew what I was reading was about something I had seen before. From then on, I started having almost real waking visions that are hard to describe as more than just in my mind's eye, but not exactly as if they were in front of me. I have a problem that is pretty much my worst nightmare. It was an 8 to 9 foot tall, naked, frozen body with long arms and legs. I know this because its head almost reached the ceiling. In my mind, it was the same face I'd seen before, but the features were smaller. Only now I had a full body that was as thin and stiff as my head and neck had been. I could only see it when it was cloudy in late fall or winter, and it was always between me and a window. So it was kind of lit from behind. It never moved in any way to do something. It just looked down at me and grinned in a terrible way. At some point in high school, I went on Wikipedia and finally found out what the Wendigo was. It's a mythical spirit creature for those who don't know. I was born in Connecticut, and about 1% of my blood comes from Native Americans. From more than 400 years ago. One of my ancestors married a Native American woman soon after the Mayflower arrived. Now, do you see what makes me so scared? Now, the Wendigo was said to be a bad spirit linked to starvation, the winter, and eating people. It either tricked people who were hungry enough to eat other people during the winter or took over those who did. There are different stories about how it looked, but most of them agree that it looks like a frozen corpse that is usually taller than a person. It doesn't have antlers like all the modern pictures you can find on Google. It is said to be able to ride on the winter wind and imitate voices to lure people into traps, and that its heart is made of ice. But here's the thing, I went through this before I knew what the creature was or what the stories were about. Only after seeing the Wendigo on and off for almost a decade did I find this description. This is from Wikipedia, and it comes after the Wendigo was gone. To the point of becoming a member. Its dried out skin was pulled tight over its bones, and the bones were pushing out against the skin. Its skin was the ash gray of death, and its eyes were pushed back into their sockets. The Wendigo looks like a skeleton that just came out of the ground. What lips it did have were torn, bloody, dirty, and had some splits in the flesh. The Wendigo had a strange and creepy smell of death, decay, and decomposition. I did more research, and all of these facts, which I got from different places, match what I saw. So I have a small connection to the Native Americans the legend is about. I have always been very scared of dead bodies, especially ones that look like they are mummified. And I saw a creature from their stories long before I realized that what I saw fit the traditional descriptions to a T. I had doubts, and I still do. But even I can't pay attention to these coincidences. I'm also a Christian, And because of my beliefs, any claims that ghosts or other supernatural beings live in the world scare me a lot. Even so, I've been thinking about this thing for years, and I saw it earlier today, which is why I'm here. Anyone learned anything? I've thought about finding a very knowledgeable person to help me figure out what to do, but I'm not sure what to do because that makes me uncomfortable from a religious point of view. Also, I promise this is not a made-up story. This has really shook me up, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you've been through something similar. Last year, I went to the National Forest in California, and had a very strange thing happen to me there. I was on a road trip by myself with my dog. I was pretty far into Mendocino National Forest. I like camping in national parks and forests because I can get away from everything. So, my dog in Rome, and they're free in exchange for sometimes rough drives into the park and a lack of service. Anyway, around 5 p.m., I was driving up this dirt road that wound up the side of a mountain. Nothing bad happened, but as I drove into the area and up the mountain, I felt very uneasy. I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I texted my boyfriend about it as long as I could before my phone stopped working. I looked for signs that someone else had been in the area recently, but I didn't find anything. I stopped my car and got out with my dog to look over the edge. There was a dead squirrel and some broken glass in the dirt, yakka. My dog made a small growling sound. She talks a lot, but I've almost never seen or heard her growl at other dogs or with them. I did hear her growl at a possum, so it could be that she smelled something. Maybe this place kept making me nervous, but I'm proud of being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to keep going, even though I was grumbling. Even though I'm proud of being an independent traveler and backpacker, this place still makes me nervous. So I decided to keep going at least a little bit further with my whining dog to see if I could find a good place to camp. I keep seeing more than just animals. Remember that no one will be more than 5 to 10 miles up this thing, if anyone is there at all. I can hear voices of men, though, and they sound close enough that I should probably call out to them. So I stopped my car, but then I kind of froze up and felt like I shouldn't. I can't really make sense of what they're saying, and I don't see any people anywhere. I get back in my car and slowly drive forward while keeping an eye out for where the voices could be coming from. I've never seen anyone else in a national park or forest when I've gone this far in. The voices that have come and gone a few times make me feel uneasy, so I give up and start to turn my car around. I really can't remember what you did on the way down. I was scared, and all I could think about was leaving. I just remember being surprised at how quickly she was grumbling when we were standing outside my car. I went back down the mountain and didn't see anyone, so I splurged and got a hotel room for the night. I thought I was fine, since big, open spaces can be scary. I told myself that the voices could have come from a long way away, even though they seemed close. Cool, animals die, glass breaks, and nothing bad happens. I remember this place, though. I still think about it when I'm walking my dog in the woods at night or watching scary movies. Nothing beats the way I felt as I drove up that mountain. And to be honest, I find it both interesting and scary. I just found out about some facts and stories about Native Americans that have made me feel very uneasy for the past 40 years. I've told a few people about this place and how spooky it made me feel, but that's about it. I googled the national park once and didn't find anything, but I didn't look too hard either. I like scary things like movies and books. Yesterday, my boyfriend and I were getting close to the end of a road trip. There were only 2 or 3 hours left, and the sun had already set. So we decided to watch some scary YouTube videos and podcasts. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files and then to a True Stories video about Native American legends. I'm half listening while petting my dog and playing Pokemon on an emulator, and I hear the narrator, Window Goes, say what they are and mention in a casual way that they can imitate voices. I'm not kidding when I say that the worst chills I've ever felt crawled down my spine. I looked at my boyfriend and asked him if he remembered that national forest. I was scared about what happened last year. He says that he does, and he reminds me that he texted me. I probably only had one more to go. I remember him saying that, but I didn't know much about their legends at the time, so I thought he was just making fun of me. Like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably following you, or some other dad joke. He said, no, I mean, I was mostly kidding, but I said that because you said you were hearing voices you couldn't find. I feel weird as hell, so I look up Window Goes there and find that it is said to be able to copy human voices and live in that area. It all made sense. There is a lot of doubtful information out there, that much is clear. But I tried to find more trustworthy sites and real experiences. I then looked for missing people in the area, and the first headline that caught my eye said, "Another family goes missing in Mendocino." I looked at different websites and news articles about missing people, but they are all a little hard to find because they are buried under websites about national parks and pictures of trees. About a year ago, I looked up the forest and didn't find anything. I also noticed that these stories didn't seem to be talked about much, which also got my attention. Over 100 people have gone missing and not been found in the last 8 years, and many others have been found dead. It just makes me feel really bad. I remember how scared I felt, how badly I wanted to leave, and it scares me to think about it. What I heard made me feel so uneasy, and it still bothers me to this day. My dog and I are very close. She was a stray that followed me home from Costa Rica after she started following me. So when she makes those little growls along the way, I feel like something is wrong, even though the video was just a story. Those tales come from some place. I have traveled alone a lot, both in and out of the country, and I have never felt so bad. I also saw a lot of dead animals in a national forest, which just seemed strange. I don't think I'll do anything like traveling by myself again unless it's near people.